Henry Ford didn't just build cars, he built an empire by outmaneuvering rivals and refusing to share control. And he started learning how to do it when he was still a farm boy who hated everything about farm life. On July 30th, 1863, near what is now Dearborn, Michigan, Henry Ford was born into a world of horse-drawn plows and endless chores. But while other farm kids accepted their fate, Henry was plotting his escape from the moment he could hold a wrench. The Ford family farm stretched across 80 acres of Michigan soil that demanded backbreaking labor from sunrise to sunset. Henry's father, William Ford, had immigrated from Ireland with dreams of prosperity through hard work and traditional values. He expected his eldest son to follow the same path, inheriting the land and the life that came with it. Henry had different plans. At age 12, Henry made a discovery that would change everything. In July 1876, near his home, Ford saw a portable steam engine operated by a local farmer. The massive machine moved without horses, mules, or human muscle. While his father saw a noisy contraption that spooked the horses, Henry saw freedom on wheels. He sprinted toward the machine and peppered the operator with questions. How did it work? How fast could it go? Could he touch the engine? The farmer was amused by the boy's intensity and let Henry examine the engine. Henry studied every detail he could see. That night, lying in his bed at the family farm, Henry couldn't sleep. He'd seen his way out, and it ran on steam and steel. The next morning, Henry began building small working engines from scrap and whatever parts he could find around the farm. When he tested one of his early homemade engines in the family kitchen, it startled his parents. But Ford was thrilled. He'd proven that he could harness the same power that moved that road engine. By 15, Henry had taught himself to repair watches with homemade tools, earning extra money that he hid from his father. But watches were just practice. His real obsession was engines, and Detroit was where engines lived. In 1879, at 16, Henry made his first bet on himself. Against his father's furious objections, he walked away from the family farm and headed to Detroit with nothing but a few dollars and an unshakable belief that machines would set him free. Detroit in 1879 was a city of opportunity for anyone willing to work with their hands. But Henry quickly learned that wanting something and getting it were two different things. His early shop jobs didn't last long. Henry was young, impatient, and already convinced he could do things better. He found work at the Flower Brothers machine shop, where he spent his days repairing steam engines and his nights studying every mechanical drawing he could find. When other workers went home, Henry stayed behind, taking apart engines piece by piece to understand how they worked. At the Detroit Dry Dock Company, Ford learned precision machining techniques that later influenced his ideas about interchangeable parts. More importantly, he learned that the difference between success and failure often came down to who was willing to work longer, think harder, and take bigger risks than their competition. In 1882, Henry returned to the family farm, but not in defeat. He'd made a deal with his father. He'd work the farm during planting and harvest seasons if he could also run a sawmill and repair steam engines for neighboring farmers during the rest of the year. For the next few years, Henry operated portable steam engines throughout southeastern Michigan, building a reputation as the man who could fix anything mechanical. But steam engines were yesterday's technology. Henry had heard rumors about something revolutionary: internal combustion engines that ran on gasoline instead of steam. In 1891, Henry took a job as an engineer with the Edison Illuminating Company in Detroit, working the night shift so he could spend his days experimenting with gasoline engines. By 1894, he had risen to chief engineer at the Edison Illuminating Company. His supervisor, Alexander Dow, became a mentor who encouraged Henry's mechanical experiments. In December 1893, in a workshop behind his Detroit home, Ford successfully started his first gasoline engine. The single-cylinder engine ran for exactly 30 seconds before sputtering to a stop, but those 30 seconds changed everything. Henry had proven to himself that he could build his way out of any situation. But knowledge without opportunity was worthless, and Henry was about to learn that the biggest obstacles to success often came from the people who were supposed to help you. Over the next 3 years, Henry refined his engine design and began building his first automobile. Working in a brick shed behind his house, he constructed what he called the quadricycle, a lightweight carriage powered by a two-cylinder gasoline engine. The vehicle was a masterpiece of practical engineering, but there was one problem: it was too wide to fit through his workshop door. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed a sledgehammer and knocked out the brickwork himself to let the machine breathe. At 2 a.m. on June 4, 1896, the quadricycle finally rolled into the street. But building a car and building a business were entirely different challenges. Henry needed investors, and investors wanted control. This fundamental conflict would define the next phase of his life and teach him lessons that would make him one of America's most ruthless businessmen. In 1899, Henry attracted the attention of wealthy Detroit investors led by William Murphy, who formed the Detroit Automobile Company with Henry as chief engineer and a capitalization of $150,000. The investors wanted Henry to build cars quickly and cheaply, using existing designs and proven methods. Henry wanted to perfect his designs even if it took longer and cost more money. The conflict was immediate and bitter. After producing only 20 vehicles in 2 years, the Detroit Automobile Company collapsed in January 1901. The investors blamed Henry's perfectionism. Henry blamed the investors' short-sighted focus on quick profits over quality engineering. The failure taught Henry a crucial lesson that would guide every future business decision. Never again would he allow other people to control his work. But first, he needed to prove that his vision was worth following, and he had a plan that was equal parts brilliant and desperate. Henry decided to build race cars, not because he loved racing, but because winning races would generate the publicity and credibility he needed to attract investors on his terms. Racing was Henry's weapon for manufacturing fame. Working with bicycle mechanic Ed "Spider" Huff, Henry built a racing car designed for one purpose: beating Alexander Winton, America's most famous race car driver. Winton had never lost a race and was considered unbeatable in his professionally built Winton Bullet. In October 1901, Henry challenged Winton to a 10-mile race at the Grosse Pointe track. The match drew thousands of spectators who came to watch the unknown mechanic get humiliated by the racing champion. Winton was heavily favored, driving a sleek, professionally built race car against Henry's homemade machine. But Henry had spent months perfecting every component of his racer, testing different gear ratios and fine-tuning the engine for maximum power. When the starting flag dropped, Winton jumped to an early lead, but Henry's car was faster on the straightaways, and by the 5th lap, he'd closed the gap. On the 8th lap, Winton's engine began misfiring. As the champion's car faltered and smoked, Henry pushed his homemade racer to the limit, roaring past Winton to the cheers of the stunned crowd. He didn't just win, he won by half a mile. The victory made headlines across the country. "Ford beats Winton," screamed the Detroit Free Press. Suddenly, Henry Ford wasn't just another failed businessman, he was the man who'd beaten America's racing champion. Investors who'd previously ignored him now competed for his attention. But Henry had learned from his previous mistakes. When Ford Motor Company was formed on June 16, 1903, Ford held only a minority stake, but he was determined to control engineering decisions. The other investors thought they were getting a talented engineer who'd learned to be more practical. They had no idea they'd just partnered with a man who was planning to revolutionize not just the automobile industry, but the entire concept of manufacturing. Henry's plan was audacious in its simplicity: build one car so well and so cheaply that everyone in America could afford it. While his competitors offered dozens of models in multiple price ranges, Henry would bet everything on a single design. The Model T, introduced on October 1, 1908, was Henry's masterpiece of practical engineering. It featured a 177 cubic inch 4-cylinder engine that produced 20 horsepower, enough to propel the 1,200-pound car at speeds up to 40 miles per hour. But the real genius wasn't in the specifications, it was in the design philosophy. The Model T was simple enough for farmers to repair with basic tools, tough enough to handle terrible roads, and reliable enough to start every morning in any weather. Traditional automobile manufacturing was essentially custom craftsmanship. Skilled workers hand-fitted each component, filing and adjusting parts to make them work together. Every car was slightly different, and production was slow and expensive. To make it happen, his engineers, men like Charles Sorensen drew inspiration from an unlikely place, the disassembly lines of Chicago slaughterhouses. They realized that if you could take a cow apart on a moving hook, you could put a car together on a moving belt. Throughout 1913, they perfected this moving assembly line at the Highland Park plant, transforming automobile production forever. By breaking car assembly into simple, repetitive tasks, Henry could hire unskilled workers and train them in hours instead of years. More importantly, he could build cars faster than anyone thought possible. The results were staggering. Assembly time for a Model T dropped from about 12 hours to about 93 minutes. Production costs plummeted, allowing Henry to cut prices while maintaining profits. In 1908, a Model T cost $825. By 1925, the price had fallen to $290. But Henry's price cuts weren't just about making cars affordable, they were a calculated strategy to destroy his competition. Every time Ford lowered prices, smaller manufacturers were forced to choose between matching Ford's prices and losing money, or maintaining their prices and losing customers. Companies like the Pope Manufacturing Company found themselves trapped in a vice that tightened with every Ford price reduction. One by one, Henry's competitors either went bankrupt or were absorbed by larger companies. The Winton Motor Carriage Company, whose founder Henry had beaten in that crucial 1901 race, ceased automobile production in 1924. The $5 day, announced on January 5, 1914, was perhaps Henry's most brilliant strategic move, though it was widely misunderstood as worker-friendly generosity. Part of that $5 a day, about double the typical wage, depended on meeting Ford's strict moral and behavioral standards. First, he eliminated worker turnover that was costing Ford millions in training expenses. The Highland Park plant had been losing workers as fast as it could hire them, with annual turnover nearly 400%. Second, he created a workforce that could afford to buy the cars they built, expanding his customer base. Third, he attracted the best workers from competing manufacturers, weakening his rivals while strengthening Ford. The strings attached to that extra money revealed Henry's true nature. Workers had to submit to home inspections by Ford's sociological department, a 200-person organization that monitored employees' personal lives, spending habits, and moral behavior. Investigators visited workers' homes unannounced, checking for cleanliness, sobriety, and proper family values. Workers who failed inspections didn't just lose the bonus, they often lost their jobs. Henry wasn't paying workers more out of kindness. He was buying the right to socially engineer his employees into ideal Americans. Ford's resistance to unionization lasted longer than any major automaker. When organizers tried to gain a foothold at the River Rouge plant, Ford's security forces met them with violence. The 1937 Battle of the Overpass saw Ford's men brutally attack United Auto Workers organizers, including union leader Walter Reuther, in full view of newspaper photographers. By 1919, Ford Motor Company was generating enormous profits, earning over $60 million annually. But Henry faced a new problem: minority shareholders who wanted their share of those profits paid out as dividends. The Dodge brothers, John and Horace, who owned 10% of Ford's stock, sued to force dividend payments. When they sued him for withholding dividends, Ford testified that he wanted to reduce prices and expand production, not maximize profits for shareholders. The court ruled against him, but Ford didn't fold. In December 1918, Henry announced his resignation from Ford Motor Company and his intention to start a new company that would build cars even cheaper than the Model T. The threat was clear. Existing Ford shareholders could either sell their stock to Henry at his price or watch their investment become worthless when his new company destroyed Ford. The bluff worked perfectly. By July 1919, using a series of shell companies and high-stakes pressure to hide his tracks, Henry and his son Edsel bought out the terrified minority shareholders for nearly $106 million. Henry Ford now owned 100% of the company, completing his transformation from a farm boy with a wrench to the undisputed king of an industrial empire. But Henry's greatest strength, his unwillingness to compromise or share control, would eventually become his greatest weakness. The same stubborn determination that had built his empire would nearly destroy it. Throughout the 1920s, while Ford continued building Model Ts with only minor modifications, Competitors like General Motors were developing new models with features that customers increasingly demanded: electric starters, better brakes, closed bodies, and multiple color options. Alfred P. Sloan, who became president of General Motors in 1923, implemented a strategy of planned obsolescence and annual model changes that directly challenged Ford's philosophy of building one perfect car forever. Henry dismissed these innovations as unnecessary complications. "Any customer can have a car painted any color so long as it's black," he famously declared, but customers were proving they wanted choices Henry refused to provide. Even as sales collapsed, Ford insisted the Model T was perfect. Dealers pleaded, executives warned him. His own son pushed for change. Ford refused, betting the company's future on his own judgment. By 1926, Model T sales were declining rapidly as customers flocked to more modern designs from Chevrolet, Chrysler, and other manufacturers. Ford dealers begged Henry to modernize the car or introduce new models, but he refused to admit that his perfect car might need improvement. The crisis came to a head in May 1927 when Ford was forced to shut down production for 6 months to retool for the Model A. During those 6 months, General Motors captured market share that Ford would never fully recover. The Model A featured mechanical brakes, a 200 cubic inch four-cylinder engine, and multiple body styles in several colors. But Ford never again dominated the automobile industry the way it had during the Model T era. Henry had learned that even the most successful gambles eventually run their course, and the price of being wrong could be measured in millions of lost sales and thousands of lost jobs. Henry Ford died on April 7, 1947, during a power outage at his Dearborn estate. The man who'd electrified American industry passed away by candlelight, a fitting end for someone who'd spent his life moving between the past and the future. Henry Ford had proven that in America, the biggest gambles could yield the biggest rewards. But he'd also demonstrated that success without adaptability was just another form of failure waiting to happen.